Could a sense of progression be brought back to raid difficulties so as to combat the "I completed LFR, I finished the game"? So having different difficulties of a raid serves an important purpose in catering for almost all of the World of Warcraft player base, but there is often a discussion around whether a new form of content really adds or just diminishes the game. I myself am a supporter of LFR being in the game, but also a Mythic Raider who would like to see more people involved in Organised Raiding. In this vlog, I'm going to discuss how the raid difficulties might be managed differently without diminishing the experience for any section of the player base. So this vlog is in response to a request from a viewer. LFR is a delicate issue and it must be understood from the beginning who are the people who engage in this content. In particular, I want to focus on the people who take part in LFR but never anything above that difficulty, raid-wise at least. Those who do normal or above in addition to LFR are not seen as an issue. Discussing the motivation for people to move from heroic to mythic progression is a regular source of debate, but of equal interest is how to incentivise people to progress from LFR to normal. So for those who only raid in LFR, we can probably split them into roughly two camps. One, those who would otherwise not access any form of raiding and thus miss out on taking part in the expansion storylines. And two, those who are satisfied with only raiding LFR as a means of accessing that storyline, but would do at least normal raiding if LFR did not exist. Now in the first case, we're talking about players who, during the Burning Crusade for example, would have known that the story of the expansion was confronting Illidan. Everything was leading up to deposing him from the Black Temple. There were extensive quest lines which non-raiders would get so far on, and then it would come to an abrupt end just when it got interesting. These players were therefore excluded from the storytelling, which is pretty grim for a role-playing game. The same applied in Wrath of the Lich King really, with many stories being accessible to a non-raider, but ultimately you would miss out on the final conclusion. Things were less harsh in Wrath because of an easier difficulty of the raids that had been devised and a much wider range of people being able to successfully pug those raids at some level than in the previous forms of the game. Roll on some years and now people can effectively play the game without any real communication with other players and still access the story in its entirety. Of course, there will be those who see this as being completely at odds with any multiplayer game, much less an MMORPG. However, there isn't anything philosophical about the debate at Blizzard about this, I'm sure, in the same way that we players have. It's a simple business debate which ends up with people not subscribing to the game if they can't access the content without an investment of either time, effort and or social skills that some modern role-playing gamers just don't have. With the second group of LFR player, those who might do organised raiding if LFR were not available, what is needed is a way to encourage those people to get involved in at least normal mode raiding without removing the provision for the first group. So we can't have important components of the storyline missing from LFR. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't have side stories in other difficulties. For example, in Throne of Thunder, the hardest mode had an extra boss in the form of Ra-Den. It wasn't part of the Mists of Pandaria story and, disappointingly, was never really followed up since, but it was some extra content not covered in LFR. So what if normal and above had an extra encounter? It couldn't be crucial to the storyline, of course, but should tell a story. So let's think of examples. So in Nighthold, maybe when you rescue Illidan and get the cinematic of him killing Gul'dan, a Legion portal opens up and you have to fight a few waves of demons, ending with a pit lord or something. It doesn't disjoint the narrative for an LFR player that they're missing out on, but it might be appealing to someone who is prepared to do normal at least if it can't possibly be seen as the same thing as LFR. The idea of having to fight a lieutenant of the real end boss, as suggested in the original query, also has merit. However, it would have to be an additional encounter, not simply giving LFR raiders an inferior final boss, because it's the deprivation of storyline for non-raiders that drives the need for LFR. LFR had to have killed Jaden because he was an integral part of the expansion storyline. The additional encounter, if there was one, doesn't actually have to be tougher. We don't really have escalating levels of difficulty in raids anyway, though we are used to the first few bosses being generally the easier ones and the last two being the most difficult. The key factor should be that it would be additional to LFR, but without depriving those who only raid LFR of any plot lines. Of course, an additional encounter by itself may not be a sufficient draw, so we might also need to consider that Blizzard has a long-standing tradition of incentivising us with cold, hard gear upgrades. So loot is potentially another way to appeal, though not just with item level of course, because that already exists. In fact, looking at Blizzard's approach to Antorus, we might even suggest that Blizzard are themselves looking at ways of incentivising LFR players to step up. The Pantheon trinkets, which had a random chance to drop from Argus, caused all manner of consternation in terms of exactly how they were implemented. But what was key was that they did not drop in LFR. In an expansion where even casual players were expected to amass a whole arsenal of legendary items, and where a legendary was obtainable for simply killing a boss, it was therefore a departure to suddenly drop loot into a raid that couldn't be obtained in LFR at all. I considered that the Pantheon trinkets were actually an experiment to see if Blizzard could reintroduce the old style of very low drop random legendaries and how the community would take to that, but it may also have been an experiment to see how people would react with powerful loot that can't be obtained in LFR but can be in normal. Were Blizzard monitoring the situation to see if more people progressed onto normal mode? If this was the case, I'd query their choice of item, however. The Pantheon trinkets could only be used to maximum effect in Antorus itself. If you're not interested in regular raiding, then there isn't much of a draw in obtaining items which are of less use outside that content. That being said, the trinkets can be upgraded to a very high level, in fact as high as any legendary item level, and the basic function still works in other content, so maybe it was a draw to some. But what other ways might there be to incentivise progression from LFR to normal without cutting LFR out of the story? Are you someone who only raids in LFR but might be willing to at least pug, but preferably guild raid normal? If so, what would motivate you? If you'd like to get involved in live discussions about this or anything Warcraft related, then join us for the Azeroth review on Tuesdays at 7 PM to 9 PM UK time. If you enjoyed this video, then please like, comment, subscribe and share with other people who might also be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.